Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, my name is Hamutahl Cohen. I work for UC Cooperative Extension, and I worked on pests and insect issues in Ventura County cropping systems. That last talk was a perfect transition to my talk, which is all about the pollinators and the insects that are visiting avocado. Okay, I'm going to skip my first couple of slides because we just heard about floral biology and avocado. We talked about pollination types. I want to say that I'm kind of interested in cross-pollination between A and B flowers and how that's impacted by pollinator species. And the first question really is, who are the avocado pollinators, especially in Ventura County where we grow avocados? What's their behavior on avocado? Which ones are moving the most pollen around? And how can we influence their populations and what they're doing in our crops? So I'm going to talk first about different pollinator groups and then share what we found about them. So the first group of pollinators are the bees. We've talked about honeybees, but there's many different species of bees. These are not necessarily avocado pollinators. These are just bees found in the US. Bees belong to the group Hymenoptera. They're related to wasps and ants. And what makes a bee is that it has these specialized branching hairs on their body. So wasps and flies will have hairs, but they're not branched like this. And this gives them like electrostatic power. Pollen gets stuck to the hairs, and when they move between flowers, they move pollen around. They use pollen, they feed it to their young for protein, and they use nectar for carbohydrates. Bees come in many different sizes. I put the smallest bee I could find next to the biggest bee I could find, the stingless bee right there on the left. You can see it relative to a honeybee. It's super duper tiny. Its whole body is like the length of a honeybee leg. And then you can see in contrast Wallace's giant bee. That's a bee found only in Indonesia, but it's the world's biggest bee. So I just wanted to share it. It lives inside active termite nests. Huge, and it uses those huge mandibles to collect resin to line its nest, not to bite or to sting. Bees also nest in a variety of different ways. So some bees are ground nesters. They'll dig their own holes, or they'll use pre-existing cavities that are left behind, let's say, by like other animals like rodents. And then some bees live above ground in cavities like pithy stems and decaying wood. And sometimes they'll dig their own nests above ground as well, like carpenter bees can bore their own nests. There's a lot of variation in how bees behave. Honeybees are highly social in these huge, huge colonies with 50,000 individuals. Bumblebees maybe have 13 to 200 individuals in a colony. And most other bees are solitary or they're semi-solitary. They live in really small groups. One of the biggest ways that bees vary is by plant specialization. Our honeybees visit almost every single kind of plant, but most of the wild bees are really limited in their number of plant partners. It's a lot fewer. Honeybees can travel up to 14 miles if they really have to. A lot of these other bees are much more narrow in their flight distances. They like to stay within 1 kilometer of their hive, maybe 2. They use different nesting materials. They engage in the environment and use environmental resources really differently. Okay, and they also vary morphologically in how they collect pollen. So some have a hairy brush on, let's say, their legs or their abdomen called a scopa. Honeybees and bumblebees, they have a corbicula, so they pack pollen totally differently on their bodies. They make these balls. And then some bees, like this one, have no pollen-carrying structure at all. This is a kleptoparasitic bee or a cuckoo bee. It actually lays its eggs inside of the nests of other bees, and then it's the eggs from this cuckoo bee will hatch and they'll eat the larva or the pollen of the other bee species. So I guess every group of organisms has parasites, social parasites. In California, we have 1,600 species of wild bees. So I just wanted to showcase 2 side by side to show the differences. So the one on the left is really tiny, sleek. It's like the fast car of bees, really kind of short hairs. And then there's the valley carpenter bee, really big and fluffy, totally different kind of bees. All right, so what about in avocado? We know the most about honeybees. Most of the research has been done on honeybees. When honeybees forage in an avocado orchard, there are 3 types of behaviors that they might engage in. So some of them will visit males and female flowers and they'll collect pollen and nectar in the same trip. Some of them will visit male and female flowers and only collect nectar. And then there's some foragers that only visit male flowers and they just collect pollen. And so those ones aren't contributing too much to pollination because in a visit, they're not going to be visiting any females. So they won't be moving pollen to a female. We know that they visit a limited area, and that's why having cross-pollination from pollinizers is important. We know that some of them are foragers and scouts, and they'll go really, really far from the hive, and that generally, like the last presentation mentioned, is if you increase honeybee density, you're going to get higher pollination rates. Okay, we have about like 60 or 70 years of research showing that when presented with plants, honeybees will always go to anything but avocado. They're a European insect, and so they really like those European and Mediterranean plants, but avocado is not attractive to them. It has high levels of minerals like potassium and phosphorus. They love citrus. Many of our avocado farms are right next to citrus farms, so they'll prefer to go to citrus over avocado. All right, bumblebees are another group of of bees that might visit avocado. I always get asked, should we put domesticated bumblebees in our hives? There hasn't been too much really evaluating bumblebees in California orchards, but studies have shown that they are very effective pollinators just close to where their nests are. It's hard to source them, and there can be issues with the spread of parasites and pathogens from introduced bumblebees to wild bumblebee populations. So it's tricky using them, comes with a lot of caveats. Okay, and then wild bees as well. There have been about 2 studies now that have evaluated which wild bees are just present on avocado farms. One was done by Gordon Franke a few years ago, another one by Cal Poly Pomona graduate students, but they were really just looking at bees in the farm, not necessarily which ones were visiting avocado flowers, but these were the main ones that they were finding. Ceratina acantha is that one is an above ground nester. And then Agopestamon and Halictus, those are below ground nesters. So those are our 3 kind of most abundant solitary wild bees in Ventura avocado farms. Across both those studies found that. Okay, 7 wasps have been found visiting avocado flowers or flying around them. Wasps, like bees, are hairy, but they don't have those branched hairs. So, we're not sure exactly what they're contributing to avocado pollination, but they're using pollen and they're using nectar. And then there's flies as well. So they can be hairy, but again, it's not branched. There's so many different species of flies, but generally they like white flowers. Avocados are white flowers. And the flies that, everyone's been talking about lately are syrphid flies because they have this immense biocontrol value in citrus. We know they're excellent predators of Asian citrus psyllid, and, it's highly likely that they're contributing to pollination of avocado as well. So there's this nice synergy between citrus and avocado there where they're utilizing both environments. But there's 9 species recorded here. We don't really know which one is the best contributor to avocado pollination. Okay, and then the flies, some of the ones that I wanted to highlight, include the blue bottle flies and the green bottle flies. These have been observed in studies globally to contribute to avocado pollination, but it hasn't been evaluated here. And then other pollinators, we think, probably are not contributing much. I know, Mary Lou, you were involved in a study looking at thrips, and you guys determined that they're not really contributing to avocado pollination. And then, there's beetles, maybe moths. We don't really know what they're doing, but they could be carrying avocado pollen, my apologies. All right, so honeybees can be fed artificially, they can be brought in, but these wild visitors, these wasps and flies and wild bees, they need habitat on site or near site in order to visit a farm. And growers sometimes will artificially enhance that by planting hedgerows or flying strips. And there can be one of 2 outcomes when you do that. You could attract all your wild pollinators to that flowering patch, and they could stay there and never leave and not visit your avocado. Or you could attract them and they can spill over into your avocado and enhance pollination. It's kind of like the big question, right? There's other pros and cons to these hedgerows and natural habitat patches. They could be attracting predators that provide pest control, insectivorous birds. overall it's just like a positive for the environment to create habitat, but they can be costly. They might only work in certain contexts, like when there's a lot of natural habitat nearby, and they could be attracting pests as well. So, we don't entirely know for avocado what role they're playing. So the research questions I've been working on with my collaborator, Neil Williams at UC Davis is, who are the avocado visitors? Like, who are the actual flies and wasps and wild bees in Ventura avocado? How are they impacted by infield habitat, so those hedgerows and flowering patches, and also the landscape level habitat? When you zoom out from the farm, there's natural habitat patches. What's that doing? And then which ones are actually contributing pollen, and what is their role relative to one another? Okay, so to answer these questions, we worked in 10 avocado sites in the last couple of years, and our sites vary. Some are really surrounded by natural habitat, and some are further away from restoration areas or natural areas. And then half our sites had intentionally planted hedgerows, and half had bare margins. So we had that kind of comparison that we could make. And then at each site, we set up a transect so that we could study pollination dynamics on the edge of a block, and then 75 meters into the interior of each block. So, we did our study in both parts of the orchard. And again, the breakdown was bare margin versus hedgerows, and then close or far from natural habitat. Okay, so we characterized what the farms looked like in two ways. So at our transect points at the edge and interior, we created these kind of circles, and we just counted and identified all the flowers that were not from avocado, whether it was from a weed or from a hedgerow. And then we used a software called ArcGIS to look at the natural habitat around each site and quantify that and say, like, this point is surrounded by 50% natural habitat or 10% natural habitat. And then we looked at visitors. So for 4 trees on the edge and 4 trees on the interior of each site, we set up quadrats, and we stood there and we waited and we watched a visitor come to an open flower, and then we caught it so that we could take it back to the lab and identify it. We did that in the morning, and then we did it again in the afternoon. And we did that several times throughout the bloom period for 2 years. And then we marked where we did those quadrats so that we could go back to those sites months later to count the fruit set and measure the fruits that resulted from those visits. And then back in the lab, we took those specimens. We're still working on identifying them, and we're counting pollen grains right now off of their bodies. Okay, so here are some of the results. The first thing is, when you look at the abundance of different visitors, honeybees were the most abundant visitors. 65% of our visitors were honeybees, followed by flies, and wild bees were only 3% of our visitors. And if you look at this graph on the right, the what wild native bees are in the green, is really shocking that we didn't see that many of them. Some of the sites we had no wild bee visitors. It was just honeybees and flies. But that's not to say that they're not contributing a disproportionately high amount of pollen when they do visit. They're really much more efficient at carrying and moving pollen than flies, but we're just not seeing them in high numbers visiting the actual flowers, even when they're living in the orchard and flying around and we see them on the hedgerow. Okay, so we ran our analyses with honeybees and wild bees separately. And Danny, just for you, I put the statistical model at the bottom because I know it's important to you. So the first thing we did was look at landscape scale around each farm within 1 kilometer. And we found that when there's more natural habitat around the farm, there are fewer visitors overall to that farm. That kind of corroborates what we already know, which is that visitors tend to prefer natural habitat over avocado habitat. Kind of makes sense. Then we looked at the differences in visitor abundance between the edge and interior at the sites that had bare margins and sites with hedgerow margins. And that was just based off dividing our farms into these like coarse categories of having a hedgerow or not having a hedgerow. It doesn't take into account the number of actual flowers on each farm. But what we saw was that there was more visitation on the edge than the interior when the margin was bare, and greater interior visitation when the margin was natural. So it's kind of tricky, but what this is saying is that when hedgerows are available on an edge, they attract visitors to the hedgerow. right? The edge visitors. But overall, those sites with hedgerows had more visitation on the interior, that they were just bringing more into the orchard overall, and more were like spilling over into the interior, even though at the edge, they would pick the hedgerow over the edge. We looked at the actual flower counts to see what was going on. And we saw that when there were more flowers, and it didn't matter, in this case, we just lumped flowers from weeds and from hedgerows together. But when there was more flowers, there was an increase in visitors to both the edge and the interior. And this was more pronounced or like more impactful in the interior, which is that dark blue line over there. So adding in non-crop flowers is increasing the number of visitors overall. And that's true for honeybees, and it's true for anything that's not a honeybee as well. Okay, so now we're kind of delving into our pollinator specimens. Right now we're working on getting all of them identified, especially the flies is kind of tricky, but we've counted the pollen grains on the flies. We're starting to see who's carrying more pollen. So the first group in this graph are the blue bottle flies. And of the ones that we caught, 100% of them had avocado pollen on their body. And they had on average 32.8 pollen grains. Another group that carried a lot of pollen were the large muscoids. So this is like multiple species that we're still sorting out, but these like large house flies that you see flying around, 25% of the individuals that we caught carried pollen, but they carried 18 pollen grains on their body. Syrphid flies, we talked about those. 50% of the ones that we caught were carrying pollen on their body. And these are ones visiting flowers. So they may have been visiting for, nectar, and that's why they weren't having, pollen on their body. And then on average, they had 8 pollen grains on their body. Right now, our collection numbers are still low. We're going to be repeating this project this year specifically to just look at the pollen loads on the different flies. We're also still getting the pollen data from the different bees. So I'm going to have more data on this in the future. But it was really interesting to see that we had a lot of fly visitors who just had no pollen on their bodies as well. So it was definitely a mixed bag. Okay, so the conclusions, the summary are visitors may prefer to visit hedgerows over avocado when they're available, but overall, there's more visitation to the interior of the orchard when there's a vegetated margin like a hedgerow, or when there's more non-crop flowers. We're going to get fruit yield data to share soon, and we'll be able to ask if this is translating to higher pollination. And then some of the pollinators are carrying more pollen than others. We don't know what that means for transferring the pollen on the flowers, but we're seeing that some might be interesting targets for pollination.
We spend a lot of resources removing the weeds and the orchard rows. So consequently, obviously, that doesn't provide any spring flowering that might help in this situation. Do you have an opinion on whether we should let some of the weeds grow longer for this?
I think it depends on what your weeds are. If you have something that's really invasive and difficult to manage, I would try to stay on top of it. But if you don't have a hedgerow that has early spring flowers, then maybe leaving weeds a little bit longer, if you can manage it, would be great. You can intentionally, when you plant hedgerows, select flowers that have early spring or even winter flowering. And we have guidelines on the UC website for which plants provide different bloom periods. So I would actually recommend going that route. So it's like a more controlled, intentional kind of provisioning. And if you email me afterwards, I can send you those resources.
I've got two questions. First one is, when you sampled the various farms, hedgerow, no hedgerow, wildlands, no wildlands, did you also look at farms that had on-site bees that were there? And did that have an impact on visitation?
All of our sites had honeybees, or honeybees like in an adjacent farm right next door. So we just like we couldn't control for that or change that as a variable. They're just kind of like present in the landscape. But we did know, when they were brought in by the beekeeper, how many there were and things like that. We haven't analyzed that, but they were just there everywhere.
And the second question is, you talked about, I think it was phosphorus, potassium, and honeybees.
Yeah.
I have heard it's not just putting on fertilizer during bloom, but potentially potassium annoys the bees and it keeps them away. I don't know if there's any truth to that statement or not.
I'm not sure. Oh, good. Mary Lou has an answer, so that's good.
Yeah. A long time ago, I had a BARD project with some researchers in Israel. And it was Shafir and Dog were the cooperators. And they looked at the potassium. So they found that they did preference feeding studies, and they found that the avocado nectar has high levels of potassium, and they theorized that did inhibit visitation. But they found that certain strains like the Carniolan actually had a little bit more tolerance to the high potassium. And so actually, I don't know if they're still doing it, but they had an avocado selection program to select strains of honeybees that might be more prone to go to avocado. But yet there was a connection with the potassium.
Okay, I know very little about insects, so I was interested to hear that they have the electrostatic situation that, the pollen checks, but how does it get dropped then?
Because they're messy. So like when a bee comes to a flower, it's not like a precise movement. Like they kind of like fumble around. The flower architecture also kind of promotes the movement. A lot of flowers have evolved so that when the bee's going to collect pollen and nectar, parts of its body brush up against the right part, against the stigma. Yeah. But it is a good question, like how sticky is the pollen and how messy the bee is important and how it falls off their body is important. And I mean, we don't really know that for the flies and the bees. It'd be really cool to do a study where we bag the flowers and then let the flies and wild bees come and then see how much they actually drop. We were debating doing that, but then we're going to keep doing pollen load counting this year, given our resources. Yeah.
Question. Have you ever tried doing any pollen viability studies on the pollen that you collect from the insects?
Ooh, no, I don't know how to do that, so you'll have to tell me how.
Anaki
and then
knows.
We'll do it. We'll send the samples to you, Anaki. So we're going to be going out to start collecting next week, so we should probably chat before then.
Question, what's the best way to increase the potential for syrphid flies, bumblebees, and that sort of thing on our farm?
I think it's not just planting hedgerows, but planting the right plants in the hedgerows. Like we know the syrphid flies like a different set of plants than say the wild bee. Syrphids like small white flowers from like alyssum or annual buckwheat, which those aren't really hedgerow plants. But the perennial buckwheat as well is great. Anything with small white flowers, whereas wild bees like more showy asters that are like yellow and orange and red. So being very purposeful in what you're planting. And another thing I see with hedgerows is people will plant fast growing large plants next to kind of slower growing small plants. And after a few years, you lose a lot of your plant diversity when certain plants get shaded out. I see that all the time. The other thing I see with the hedgerows is they need some maintenance. So if you just, plant it and set it and forget it, they end up looking really sad 5 years down the line. So sometimes they might need to be replanted. They might need irrigation for a couple of years to get established. Or they might need weeding or even herbicide treatment just to get them kind of set for a bit. But all those things I think will help provision for a variety of pollinators. Be really fun if someone planted a hedgerow inside of their farm, like in the block. And if someone ever does that, let me know. It'd be fun to see what's visiting and how that impacts things. Oh, I don't think there's any Zoom questions. Do you have any idea of the visitors that carry pollen? Which one of those are active during overlap, during the female phase, so they can actually affect pollination? That's a really good question. We actually do have that data because we wrote down the time that we did the visitors, and we also wrote down for each visitor if it was visiting a male or female flower and if it was collecting pollen or nectar. But I haven't looked at that data yet, but that's a great reminder to do that. So it sounds like I'll give another project update next year, hopefully with the answer to that.
Do the blue bottle, the house flies, blue bottle flies with high pollen loads revisit flowers because they're not collecting for any purpose? They're just out there, right?
Well, they're collecting for nectar and possibly for pollen as well, but definitely for nectar.
But are they revisiting those flowers?
Like,
with
do they
those-
do multiple visits and move? I don't know.
Yeah, because those are pretty easy to attract.
I don't know a lot about flies, but I'm assuming that like bees, they're kind of evolved to be efficient so that they'll visit multiple things on a foraging trip. And they can be really haphazard in their foraging, whereas bees are much more like go down a row systematically. But that can be good for pollination when they're more haphazard.
Thank you for your talk, Hamutahl.